Welcome to this lecture in the series on the history of New Orleans with me, Bruce Baker. And the topic of this lecture is the Imperial origins of New Orleans. We're going to start with a basic sort of geographical question, which we often think about with the city of New Orleans, which is, to what extent was New Orleans founded in an inevitable and natural location? We think of it at the bottom of the Mississippi River, almost where the river comes out to the Gulf of Mexico, and to some extent it just sort of seems logical. But if we understand why New Orleans was located where it was, we'll understand how it fit into the larger imperial context of which it was a part, and how its establishment affected but did not determine the city's future trajectory. And I think here there's a really interesting little sort of insight. A geographer named Pierce Lewis in 1976 described New Orleans as an impossible but inevitable city, meaning that you sort of have to have a city to function as a port at the bottom of the Mississippi River basin, but that it's difficult to build a city in a swamp like New Orleans was. And this view has been repeated a lot. We've heard it a lot after Hurricane Katrina and questions about rebuilding New Orleans and sort of what the purpose of the city was going to be, whether it was going to come back to what it was before, and so forth. But I think it's interesting, in 2012, Lawrence Powell, whose book, The Accidental City, is the basis for a lot of these early lectures in the series, he disagrees with that, and he says, quote, "In truth, the founding of New Orleans had less to do with the imperatives of geography than with the cunning of history," end quote. And I like that phrase, the cunning of history, so that's what we'll try to get at today. So in this lecture, I would say, if we want to boil it down into one main point, the main point is that at the beginning of the 18th century, the future site of New Orleans was on the periphery of several important imperial systems and Native American groups. So this lecture is going to take us right up to the point where people actually move in, or well, permanent European settlers move into New Orleans in 1718. So we're going to sort of look at the background for that. But before we do that, let's think about where the city of New Orleans is. And to do that, we'll look at a number of maps. There are image credits at the end of this, and of course, if I've stolen somebody's copyrighted image, please get in touch with me and I will find an alternative and re-record this, but hopefully nobody minds too much. So, where is New Orleans? Do this, we're going to look just at the slides for a little while. So, as we can see here where the pin is in this Google map, that just gives us a sense of where on the Gulf of Mexico it is. It sits within, let's see if I can move the cursor around. So it sits at the bottom of the Mississippi River, which is here, and it is the point where the Mississippi River basin, which drains a huge area, well, not the Great Lakes, but it drains a vast area of the North American continent, and it all drains into the Mississippi River and comes out into the Gulf of Mexico there. It also is important to think of it not just, it's not as simple as the river hitting the sea, because of course New Orleans sits about 100 miles up the Mississippi River from the mouth of the river where it empties into the Gulf of Mexico. And it's also important to be aware of the bodies of water near New Orleans. So this is the Mississippi River coming along here and then going down through here and eventually emptying out into the Gulf a little ways past here at a series of passes. But the city of New Orleans sits on this narrow little isthmus, which is a difficult word to say, between the Mississippi River and Lake Pontchartrain. Now, it's important to note that Lake Pontchartrain, you can actually navigate by water to Lake Bourne and then out to the Gulf of Mexico. So that becomes very significant. Biloxi in Mississippi, sort of a little further along the coast, is another important early French settlement. But obviously, it becomes less important than New Orleans later on. But it's important to sort of understand that the city of New Orleans is very much associated with the Mississippi River, obviously, but it wouldn't be where it is, and it wouldn't have had the history that it does if it weren't for these other bodies of water that it's connected to. Another very important thing to bear in mind is the elevation of the city. So this is Lake Pontchartrain. This sort of dark blue here is the Mississippi River, and the red and orange colors are higher elevation. This dark blue is actually areas that are below sea level. And so we can see that the highest land in the city sits on the banks of the river along here. There's also this high bit, which I should have looked this up, but I'm pretty sure it's called the Gentilly Ridge. But the rest of it, you can sort of see the land sort of slopes back with the high bit near the river and then sort of tapering back to very low-lying area along the edge of Lake Pontchartrain. And again, this impacts the whole history of the city and the way that it develops and where different areas are settled at different times and so forth. This is because the reason the land is highest near the river, we might think of, certainly in the place where I live, the highest land is not near the river, but that's because we have hills and rivers are at the bottoms of the hill and so forth. In this area, the Mississippi River Delta area, there really are no effective natural hills, and this high ground, such as it is in New Orleans, is created as a natural levee. And if you think about it, if you think about how rivers work and carrying sediment and flooding and so forth, it makes sense because you start out with something that looks like this. Sort of before the flood, you've got the riverbank, you've got the river down in the channel where it belongs. Then you have a flood. And when the flood comes, very thick, coarse sediment that's carried is heaviest, and so it drops first. And then as the floodwaters sort of spread out, the lighter, finer silt might get carried further and further from the edge of the river and sort of drop there. And after this happens over and over again, we get a sort of pile, or levee, to use the technical term, a levee made of sediment that has come out of the river during floods and been deposited near and sort of lower lying land, further beyond, because there's simply not as much sediment piling up there. And it's exactly on one of these natural levees that the city of New Orleans eventually is founded. It's also, to come back to water routes and so forth, it's useful to know that Bayou St, we can sort of see the crescent of the river here, and Bayou St. John, which is a bayou, a sort of water course that originates sort of somewhere around here and sort of drains this way. This comes out onto Lake Pontchartrain, and then of course you can get out to the Gulf of Mexico. So by putting the city here, you have fairly close access to the head of Bayou St. John, and then you can sort of go down the bayou to Lake Pontchartrain and get out to the Gulf and the open sea. So again, we can see that there are some logical reasons, especially considering that water is your best form of transport at this point. Before I come to a discussion of how imperial powers sort of laid themselves out in the Caribbean, let me just talk a little bit about the Native Americans who populated the lower Mississippi Valley at this time. So I won't put a map up here because I don't think it's particularly useful. It will take too long to explain, but it's important to bear in mind that even though the Indian population had been reduced considerably by disease, they very much outnumbered non-Indians until the end of the 18th century. So until about 1800, in the lower Mississippi Valley, there were more Native Americans than non-Native Americans. This is really significant, and it's also quite different from the English settlements on the Atlantic seaboard, New England and Virginia and Carolina and so forth. There are many different groups of Indians with different languages, and they were geographically mobile, so they weren't necessarily permanently tied to a particular place. When we come to think of how the French interacted with the Indians, they followed the same model that they had in Canada, which is a place that had been established for some time by now. And the most useful way to think about this is what the historian Richard White calls the concept of the middle ground. And so the middle ground, and it's from a very well-known, very influential, excellent book by Richard White called The Middle Ground, which is about relations between the French and Indians in the Great Lakes region. And he describes the middle ground in this way. The place in between cultures, peoples, and in between empires and the non-state world of villages. On the middle ground, diverse people adjust their differences through what amounts to a process of creative and often expedient misunderstandings. People try to persuade others who are different from themselves by appealing to what they perceive to be the values and practices of those others. They often misinterpret and distort both the values and the practices of those they deal with. But from these misunderstandings arise new meanings, and through them, new practices. They share meanings and practices of the middle ground. So it's important to bear in mind here that the French and the Indians had very different understandings of power. So the French were ruled by a king who's an absolute monarch, and they think very much in terms of the metaphor of fathers and have a hierarchical structure of power. The king is, especially at this point as an absolute monarch, is the absolute pinnacle, and all sort of power sort of flows from the king and responsibilities flow back up to the king. Native Americans are very different. They have a much more, what we might think of as much more horizontal rather than hierarchical sort of polity. And they have a number of local chiefs rather than a single absolutist monarch. The Native American societies in this part of North America tend to be matrilineal rather than patrilineal. So it's not really the father who's the important male figure in the family, it's actually the uncle, the mother's brother. So when the French talk about the king and the father and so forth, it doesn't resonate in the same way, or certainly the same way that they intended or thought that it would. However, the French tended to have good relations with Native Americans, particularly in Louisiana, because number one, they relied upon them for food. So you kind of have to, get along pretty well. And they also have military alliances with them to defend against encroachment by the British. So for these sort of compelling reasons, the French established and worked really hard to maintain fairly decent relations with Native Americans, more or less. There's also a practice of truchement, which means young men, young Frenchmen, living in Indian villages for several years at a time and learning the languages and the culture and just sort of understanding their neighbors. And this is rather different than we see in some of the other colonies in North America. And one of the things that this leads into, or one of the things that ties into this, is the giving of presents. And this is an important way of establishing and maintaining and sort of displaying relationships. So the French giving presents to local Native American chieftains is a sign of friendship and alliance and ultimately respect. They're sort of treated as equals. It's not really a sort of kind of charity from somebody on high and so forth. It's more like you might bring flowers or a bottle of wine to somebody's house when you go to visit, that sort of present. In this case, the presents are more things like textiles, guns, tools, things like that, things that are actually going to be useful. The Indians, in return, gave the French food. They traded furs to them. And this becomes a sort of annual ceremony that just sort of reestablishes and reaffirms the ties between these communities and becomes just sort of confirming that these two communities still have good relations. And the problem is, if that breaks down, if this present giving system breaks down, then relations are strained because it suggests that maybe you don't actually value this relationship and this friendship as much as we thought, and that's going to have some pretty unfortunate consequences later for all concerned, especially for the French. So if we think about how Louisiana connects up to the other imperial powers, other colonies in the Caribbean, we want to look at, here's Louisiana, and French settlements are in blue here. So there's really very little French presence in the Caribbean. The other really important thing is Saint-Domingue here, which eventually becomes Haiti. The other major, I suppose the other thing to say is that Louisiana obviously sits on the edge of the North American continent, but it's also very important to think of it on the edge of the Caribbean basin. So we can understand Louisiana and New Orleans as a place where North America meets and interacts with the Caribbean. And that's going to be a theme across this entire series of lectures. So if we think about the imperial powers that do have substantial holdings, the red is Spain, of course. They're the largest. They discover vast quantities of silver in Mexico and a little further down here in Bolivia in the 16th century, and this discovery of silver makes Spain tremendously powerful. The northern edge of New Spain is never very densely settled, but we can see that they do have a presence in what eventually becomes Texas and also in Florida, but obviously not a very dense presence there. The British, as we know, have set up a string of colonies sort of running up this way. They also have a few small little spots here. They have some in the Leeward Islands, so I can't really quite... Oh, sorry, the Windward Islands is what I was looking for. So Barbados is quite important. It's kind of the first island that the weather patterns and so forth bring you to when you're sailing across. So the British have Barbados, they have Jamaica, as we sort of know. They've got a couple of little bits on the Central American coast, Belize and the Mosquito Coast. The Dutch have a couple of little spots there, the sort of gold ones. And then we have the French with Saint-Domingue and eventually Louisiana. So to put this in the sort of perspective of sort of what France is doing imperially and why does France wind up in the Caribbean. So essentially, Louis XIV wanted imperial possessions and wanted these overseas colonies as a way to provide some quick money, some fast profits, because France had been spending a lot of money fighting wars in Europe. Unfortunately, that's really about the extent, I suppose, of the plan that France had. Again, to once again quote Lawrence Powell, he says French colonial policy in North America was largely one of aimlessness and drift. And we'll really sort of see that play out in the next couple of lectures. In terms of the sort of overall goals of these different imperial powers, well, Spain had a pretty clear policy, and I'm setting aside sort of religious aspects because that is a significant part. I'm setting aside a lot of stuff, really. Trying to keep this short and sort of focused. But if we think about sort of economics, Spain's whole point, I suppose, is to bring silver to Spain. That boosts its power in Europe and allows them to do all sorts of things. Other colonial powers in this area are effectively trying to trade with Spain to get some of that silver. And there's a continual struggle or continual tension here between mercantile policy, mercantilism, and trade and smuggling, because these other colonies shouldn't be trading with the Spanish colonies to get the silver. They should, under mercantilism, be trading just with the mother country. And they should be sending raw materials to France or England or wherever, and then getting all of their finished products back from that place. However, this only works if the colony has something, some sort of raw materials to send to the central country in sufficient quantities, and also if the center of the empire can actually supply the finished goods. And in the case of Louisiana, in the case of New Orleans, both of those things break down. And so neither of those things, the supplying raw materials and the getting finished goods back, doesn't really work. So the whole system starts to break down a bit. So yes, definition of mercantilism, again, from Lawrence Powell. I should probably, if I made any money from this, I would send in royalties, but anyway. So we're going to finish off this bit of lecture, again, leading up to the point where New Orleans is established. We're going to finish off this bit of the lecture with a few early encounters that lead up to the settlement of New Orleans in 1718. So in 1682, La Salle, the French explorer, who's based in Canada, because Canada has been established for some time now, sort of works his way down the Mississippi River and actually sort of comes out in the Gulf of Mexico. And so this is really sort of the first time that the French have come from Canada and come out to the Gulf and sort of understand how the continent lays out, and what the role of the Mississippi River is, and so on. In 1687, La Salle tried to go the opposite direction. He started in the Gulf of Mexico and tried to find the Mississippi River to go back up to Canada. Unfortunately, he sort of floundered around for a while, got lost. His men eventually got fed up with being led around in swamps and so forth and shot him in the head. But that's what happens. Then in 1699, we get the first permanent French settlement on the Gulf Coast, and that's near Biloxi, and it's established by a guy named Iberville. And then there are sort of, again, as I mentioned in one of the other lectures, there are a few sort of intermittent attempts to plant tobacco along the Gulf Coast, but we're just going to wrap things up there for now until we get to the actual establishment of New Orleans in 1718. We'll also look into a bit more about more detail about the sort of economic purpose and how that worked. And before we go, I'm going to give us a look at the image credits. So there's a map from Google Images, a couple of maps are from Google Maps. There's a map with a yellow background in the lakes. I think that might come from the BBC. It looks like their maps. The elevation map was from Professor Ivor Van Heerden, who was a hurricane scientist formerly at Louisiana State University. I have no idea where the diagram about the natural levee formation comes from originally, nor the map of the Imperial powers in the Caribbean. But that's it for now. Hope you enjoyed it, and we'll catch up with you at the next of these.